Most modern remakes achieve precisely two things. In the first place, they make you nostalgic for the original. In the second, they make you wonder just who the hell thought this was a good idea, and who do they think they are, and what do they take me for? The failure is often one of imagination on the part of the studio, and a distinct lack of care. Their sole aim is to force member berries down the gizzard of a naively hopeful audience, capitalizing and profiting off the genius of better men and better times, and spending not a second asking what it is that made the originals what they were, why they were so beloved, how they were achieved without recourse to big green screens and bigger budgets. A rogues gallery from just the last few years is enough to impress the point upon you. Seldom has any culture produced such a travesty as Ghostbusters 2016, which thought women are a substitute for wit. 2018's Robin Hood saw fit only to clad one of history's most lovable rogues in clothes bought from Zara. Keanu Reeves in 2008's The Day the Earth Stood Still demonstrated a significantly smaller acting range than the robot in the 1951 original, while the film itself was, as modern things often are, alien to the moral message of its ancestor. The less said about Netflix's Hellboy the better, and Disney Star Wars, The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi are in almost all respects remakes, not sequels, managed to throw one of cinema's most renowned and beloved franchises in a ditch and bugger it to death before buggering the corpse for good measure. Part of this is because we have until recently lived in exceptionally boring times, and boring times produce boring people. Conflict and existential strife drive imagination and innovation, and always have. St. Augustine wrote The City of God in response to the fall of Rome. Oscar Wilde's extremely moving De Profundis was written from the prison into which he was thrown for the crime of loving the tempestuous boy of boxing's own Marquess of Queensberry. Indeed, the overrepresentation of the gays in art is a product of their suffering, while the absence of any Wildean equivalent today, and the tawdry excess that passes for gay art in modern times, is largely the product of the easy lives we now lead. Much the same point could be made of black music, the blues, rock and roll, which, to the extent it is still innovative, is innovative in unpleasant ways. Drill as a genre is profoundly evil, but still in its own way profound, and born of the particular grit of urban strife which is the cultural equivalent of iron shackles. Wilfred Owen wrote some of the most memorable poetry in the English language, drawing from his suffering through trench warfare in World War I, and W. H. Auden wrote powerfully both on World War II and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, this last bringing us toward the era in which this video is set, the last time Western civilization underwent existential strife, the Cold War. The absence of good art, and specifically good remakes, since the fall of the Soviet Union is, I contend, the product of the fall of the Soviet Union. A damned good thing. But someone once lamented the reason to regret the end of the Cold War was that at least during it we knew what we were about. The 1970s and 80s produced some of the last good remakes. By good, I mean remakes that both understood the point of their antecedents, but that also possessed equivalent creative imagination to add something, to repurpose them, with a modern message at least equal to, and sometimes better expressed than their forebears. And since it is, or was until recently, Halloween, this seems as good a time as any to revisit one of them in particular, 1978's Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Starring something like the Nerd's holy triptych of Donald Sutherland, a young Jeff Goldblum, and Leonard Nimoy, who, like Christopher Lee, was never young, this remake of the 1956 original, itself based on Jack Finney's book The Body Snatchers, published in 1954, is probably the best example of a film capturing the existential angst of its time. Its perfect distillation of Cold War paranoia is better passed as social commentary than it is as science fiction, though it marries the two to sublime effect. Unlike the more innocent 1960s, the 70s and the early 80s were defined not by wonder and worry at the threat of aliens from out there, but rather the fear of aliens among us. Its closest equivalent is John Carpenter's 1982 reimagining of 1951's The Thing. Indeed, they are accurately described as having a familial relation, and whether Carpenter's film could have happened without Body Snatchers, directed by Philip Kaufman, is at least questionable. They are related, too, in being reworks of originals from roughly the same era. The original version of The Thing, called The Thing from Another World, came out in 1951, the original Body Snatchers in 1956. What makes the remakes exceptional is not, in fact, their faithful retelling of old stories. Quite the contrary. It is that they took the old ideas and evolved them. 1951's The Thing barely constitutes a horror film. a product of an innocent time, not all that long since the Soviet Union was an ally and Stalin was Uncle Joe, and made at a time when wartime scientific innovations were providing a real peace dividend. Werner von Braun, architect of the Nazi V-2 rocket program, lamented that his rockets had all landed on the wrong planet, but now his beatific dream of interstellar flight was being turned to something like its first iteration. It is, first and foremost, a story of discovery, of a genuine alien threat, and of a plucky band of scientists coming together to see off a monster that was definitively other, beyond themselves, a conventional enemy. 1956's invasion of the Body Snatchers provides a little contrast, being comparatively dark even for its time, with more than a little menace, reflecting a growing awareness in the American psyche of a new enemy that could not be understood in the old way. Every enemy America has ever faced, at least since the Civil War, was over there, a separate and clearly defined entity. In the 56 retelling of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, though, the enemy was not so comfortably distant, nor so clearly the other. It was here, it was among us, it was at home. It was, in fact, us, or it could be. McCarthyism was the flavour of the time, and though we have come to associate it, not all that wisely, with a baseless and even fanatical pursuit of an imaginary enemy, it was at that time reflecting a real fear that communism was not there, it was here among us. To borrow from a later speech by President Kennedy,
"For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. It conducts the Cold War, in short, with a wartime discipline no democracy would ever hope or wish to match."
Beginning to be felt in the 1956 film is a distrust not of the enemy but of the self. The premise in both the original and the remake is that alien spores have fallen to Earth, here to grow into large seed pods capable of producing identical copies of humans, which include everything about their originals, memories, appearances, looks, except that defining trait of the human, emotion. They are the same but other, but their sameness is the threat, because it is impossible to tell who you used to know, which friends, which colleagues, which lovers, have been co-opted by this monolithic and ruthless conspiracy. The original begins to explore a profound distrust of the cultural self that reaches its apogee in the remake, and as a social study provides a fascinating insight into a real loss of innocence, otherwise an overused phrase, as what once defined Western nations generally, but Anglospheric nations particularly, the fundamental trustworthiness of neighbours and especially of institutions, government, the police, begins to fall away. And to whom then do you turn for help? How do you combat a conspiracy if those you are supposed to inform could themselves be a part of that conspiracy? The ending of the 56 film is ambiguous, but errs on the side of optimism, picking up from the opening sequence where a psychiatrist is called in to deal with a man who appears then to be raving mad. That same man, the main character, Dr. Miles Burnell, has at last escaped a town's worth of replica people and reached what seems to be an unscathed institution. Earlier in the film, we see the seed pods being loaded onto trucks destined for other American towns, a clear sign that the conspiracy is one against the country as a whole. But the implication is that that plot has been discovered early enough to be stopped, and one gets the sense that the distant authorities reached by Burnell at the close of the film are probably outside the bounds of the nascent conspiracy. They assume Burnell is mad until a man is brought in following a traffic collision, who was found under a pile of seed pods coming from the self-same town. The film ends with the psychiatrist urgently telling the police to sound the alarm. The message of the film: there is still time to stop it if we act quickly. A mere 2 decades later, however, and the mood has turned decisively. The film stars the same cast of characters, but remember the original Mr. Burnell because we'll see him again. Here, Burnell is played by Donald Sutherland. He works for the San Francisco Health Department alongside colleague and love interest, though she is married, Elizabeth Driscoll. Driscoll is the first to find one of the flowers that pop up innocuously enough throughout the first act, taking one home to her husband. The opening can seem slow to modern audiences, but it is deliberately, even masterfully so. We begin with life seemingly as normal, and are introduced to a host of ancillary characters one might meet in day-to-day life: a homeless man playing the guitar sitting next to his dog, with whom Bennell is familiar, the old Chinese couple who own a dry cleaners, the wife who turns up at a psychiatrist's office with concerns about her husband. All of these are worth remembering, because it is precisely their normalcy that the film exploits. The story is subtle. The actually impactful events of the first act occur off-screen. They are only hinted at, and their effects only show up through these ancillary characters. Elizabeth's husband is acting differently. The old Chinese man asks Bennell for help, believing he is a doctor, because his wife is different. "That not my wife," he says. And the woman worried for her husband is concerned about his newly odd behaviour. All the while, we are kept ignorant through the development of our main cast. An odd cast of characters, and here the word character is key, because it is only by developing their character that the eventual payoff is properly appreciated. Sutherland Bennell is a put-upon public health employee, whose car window is smashed by the employees of a restaurant he condemns for poor health standards. Elizabeth Driscoll is married, but the impression is given early on that the marriage is not perfectly happy. She and Bennell have the real chemistry, the jokes, the implied history. She confides in him over wine in his garden. It's to him that she first brings her doubt when her husband, Jeffrey, begins acting distant, different. She follows him for a day, seeing him meeting with strangers, passing packages between themselves. All day she follows him. The peculiarity on its own would be suspicious. But it's made increasingly threatening by the soundtrack, more a soundscape than a score for much of the film. All discordant synths and the sinister throbbing of a synthesizer, almost certainly modelled on an ultrasound scanner, which recurs later in forms both more sinister and more recognisable. A work of minimalistic genius by composer Danny Zeitlin that borrows from John Carpenter's more esoteric scores, while adding something darker even than those, a peculiar and unsettling mix of the organic and the unnatural. Things are not right, but they are again uncertain, at once ordinary and odd. But here is an understated work of genius. You'll recall my injunction to remember the original Dr. Bennell.
Can I tell it to you again?
Oh my God! Oh my God! Lock the door! Lock the door!
They're coming! They're coming! Help! Help! They're coming! They're coming! Listen to me!
No, he's smashed out of his
Help
skull.
me! You're next, please! Please! You're next! We're in danger! Please, listen to me! Something terrible! Please! You're next! Here they are! They're already here! Come! You're next! They're coming! They're
He
coming!
must have done something. The policeman will help.
Oh my God. That poor man.
And here again, that vague sense that the wrongness runs deep. As the madman lies dead, the police are there but do nothing. Later, when Sutherland Bennell tries to report the incident, he is rebuffed. The police are not interested. They bat him away. But on we go. Bennell is friends with David Kibner, famous psychiatrist and author, played by Leonard Nimoy. Charismatic and knowledgeable in that way peculiar to psychiatrists, see Jordan Peterson, and well-connected. He is hosting a book signing. Jeff Goldblum's character is there, the eccentric poet whom nobody reads, probably on the autistic spectrum, full of himself with nothing to show for it save an unjustifiably inflated ego, and the bitterness writers often feel toward those in their trade who are more successful than they are. He has a frenetic, nervous energy about him. He compares himself to the great poets, and detests Kibner. Kibner churns out the books while he agonizes for months over a single line. Later we meet his wife, Nancy, wide-eyed and innocent, almost schoolgirlish. More than a little new age, she runs a spa with mud baths and plays music to her plants. Music is great for the plants, she says. They love it. But even the plants are suspect now. You might recognize her from Alien. An actress with a good scream is integral to any good horror. At Kibner's book signing, he is accosted by an hysterical woman who insists that her husband has changed. She's in tears, she's terrified. This resonates with Elizabeth, who of course feels the same way about her own husband, has recognised it elsewhere, but Kibner, the psychologist, rebuffs her, counsels the crying woman, sends her off with her husband, and later explains Elizabeth's problems away in a similar manner. He psychologizes her, pathologizes her, raises the prospect of projection, that she is finding inventive excuses to give voice to a deep-seated unhappiness in her own marriage. The genius of Nimoy's character is that he, alone of all the main cast, is ambiguous from the off. If you've already seen the film and are looking back, or if you already have some idea what's happening, he is the one who might already have been captured, who might already be one of them. Certainly he's been got before the rest, but his character further blurs the line between the known and the unknown. Here, we do not know how far the conspiracy has travelled because our characters are only dimly aware of it. We get the sense that Kibner might know something, or he might be something. But at the same time, perhaps his response is the natural response of a psychiatrist encountering the unusual, which is, more often than not, to reduce it to the usual. One detects a comment here on the nature of his type. Even if he's not cognitively against them, we shortly discover that he is doing the work of the enemy, consciously or not. Here the narrative splits. One path takes us off to the mud baths, where Goldblum's character, Jack Belichick, goes to unwind while his wife plays music to her plants and massages a morbidly unpleasant, morbidly obese man. And a sinister beardo weirdo reads Velikovsky's World in Collision. By the standards of modern film, this counts as subtle foreshadowing. He's given her a pretty flower, one to which she plays her music. It's only after he's gone, and she's closing up for the night, that she goes to wake up Jack to find that it's not Jack at all. It's what appears to be a dead body, all red veins covered in white wisps, something or only partially formed. The other path sees Bennell take Elizabeth home, trying to reassure her. Her husband, Jeffrey, takes a flower up to her room. Bennell is called back to the Belichicks to examine the body. It's got no detail, no character, it's unformed, Jack observes, and they quickly deduce that it is no mere body at all. It has no fingerprints. It is, Bennell observes, like a fetus, but one which shares, to an uncanny degree, Jack's physical characteristics, his height, his weight. When he gets a nosebleed, its nose bleeds. When he goes to sleep, it opens its eyes. And when Bennell tries to call her, Elizabeth isn't answering. We see her asleep, her face covered in some of the same odd, wispy white hair as covers the body, and Jeffrey disconnects the phone. For a film as ostensibly slow as this, soundtrack is again essential. While Jack sleeps and Nancy wanders about worried, we hear a more naturalistically discordant tone, a piano principally, as opposed to the earlier and later synthesizers, in a score that bears some resemblance to Wendy Carlos's later work with The Shining, as in the scene with the twins before the elevator. Zeitlin's work is unusual in that it is memorable without having recourse to the type of leitmotif utilized most famously in film by John Williams, drawing heavily on the likes of Wagner and Holst. There are no themes as such to Zeitlin's score, no tune you can hum afterwards, and yet it does stick in the mind. It, more than any other single aspect of the film, is responsible for the mood of the film. Meanwhile, Bennell rushes to Elizabeth's house and breaks in, there to find another body. This one, more recognisably a copy, though still not fully formed. It's one of the few places in the film where one has cause to criticise the acting. Sutherland's reaction isn't, given the circumstances, much of a reaction. He doesn't seem especially shocked or horrified or mortified by what he sees. His eyes are watering, but he's not especially sad, nor is he particularly fearful. These moments don't pop up too often, which is a blessing, but when they do, they are invariably Sutherland's. And when good actors frequently suffer missteps such as this, we can usually blame poor direction. See any film by George Lucas, for instance. This scene isn't especially helped by Zeitlin's reversion to a musical genre that really belongs to a horror film of at least a decade earlier, hammy drama with conventional instrumentation. But though this scene falls rather flat, it is mercifully short enough that it doesn't detract from the good work done before and after it. The real Elizabeth is asleep in her bed, but Sutherland has to abort his attempt to wake her up when Jeffrey enters to check on her progress, placing a hand on her heart to see if she is still alive. Only once he's left can Bennell rescue her, smuggling her out of the house. The film style here is again more classical, a single static camera placed at an angle taking in the flight of stairs. In one shot we see Jeffrey descend and leave the hall, then Sutherland creeping down with Elizabeth and leaving by another way, then Jeffrey going back upstairs carrying something that might be a body bag. It fits the mood. However, despite its reversion to a more classical style, the lighting is almost black and white, casting long shadows. It's conventional but not distracting, as again is the soundtrack, a staccato segment driven by cello, gradually building with the rest of the string section as Bennell puts Elizabeth in his car and drives away. Behind them, in the final moment of the scene, we hear a noise, a kind of inhuman screech or scream, that we'll have cause to remember later on, and, indeed, because it is so effective, long after the film is finished. Back at the Belichick's, Kibner has arrived, but the body is gone. Another clever device occurs. Nancy notes the only thing in the room that has changed besides the disappearance of the body, someone has opened the window, and she goes to close it. We see outside, unremarked upon by the cast because to the characters it is so unremarkable, a garbage lorry compressing the trash and driving off. Once again, the genius of the film, the heart of its paranoia, rests on the unseen corruption of the mundane. You realize, or you think you realize, as the characters do not, what has probably occurred. Then you find yourself casting your mind back. Where have you seen the garbage lorry before? What was it doing there? Should it have been there? Even if it should have been there, is it there for the reasons it should be? Gradually, the audience is treated to the unfolding of a conspiracy they have never actually seen happen. It crept by unnoticed. By that stealth from those covert means we find in the Cold War speech by Kennedy. It's happened already, or is happening already, and you barely noticed it. Enter the police, as Bennell calls them to Elizabeth's and Jeffrey's house to report another body, which is also now gone. Kibner is in the room, as is Jeffrey. Kibner rubbishes Bennell's story and argues with him as the police exchange quiet words with Jeffrey, on whose face the camera sits askew. Awkwardly, though he himself shows no emotion. He exchanges nothing more than glances with the police, but it's enough to make you pretty damn sure they're now in on it too. And it's from here that the film begins the transition from building the conspiracy by night to revealing it by day. All our main cast are by now aware and largely united on their interpretation of events, all save Kibner, who makes the ordinary point that the accusations sound insane. Kibner is the only one who has seen none of what's gone on, does in fact react as any outsider would react, nonetheless offers to help by connecting Bennell with the mayor's office. Bennell wants to enact emergency procedures to treat what's happening as a kind of pandemic. Kibner offers to facilitate a telephone call because, to quote him, "I've known you too long not to believe you." But as the camera follows Kibner down, he gets into a car with Jeffrey and says, "The sooner the better." So, whether he was one of them before or one of us, we now know he is one of them. You can argue about the effectiveness of this reveal. By modern standards, it's a little formulaic, a little bit too conventionally sinister. But as with all films built on suspense, the truth has to come out sooner or later. Jaws, for example, takes a very long time to reveal the shark, but the shark has to be revealed in the end. The difference here is that the audience is now in on the plot, but the characters are not. And what follows is as unquestionably good as the last scene is objectively questionable in its technique. Bennell begins phoning various city and state departments. The first seem to take him seriously, promising to call him back. They want to know everything he knows, they say. But as he goes from phone to phone and we're treated to snippets of the conversations, we begin to pick up a constant theme. He never gets through to the people he wants to speak to, only to their representatives. Variants of a phrase are constantly repeated. Don't tell anyone. Keep this to yourself for the time being. Whatever you do, don't tell anyone. We don't want to create a panic. Be extremely cautious. Don't tell anyone. Remember the Chinese couple from the beginning? They're fine now. Much better. The panicky woman? Nope. Everything's sorted. No problems here. People are returning to normal, and the phone calls, which give the illusion of progress, achieve nothing. Back at home, our cast is settling in for the night. It's dark, the mood is tense, claustrophobic. They go to bed. Kibner gives Elizabeth sleeping pills, offers to drive the Belichick's home. "You've done everything you possibly can," he says. "Get some sleep." Bennell goes out onto the roof garden. Inside, the fire is burning. Nancy is the only one awake, and eventually Bennell drifts off himself. Here we see the most viscerally horrific part of the film, the part that comes closest to the art form perfected later by practical effects in The Thing. The garden is full of pods, and accompanied by that unsettling ultrasound score, this time almost unadorned by synthesizers, it really does sound like an ultrasound scan for large parts. The pods begin to hatch, and while our characters sleep, their replicas are born, looking like perverse fetuses, covered in hair and slime, unformed, faces like demonic babies. The noises they make are so close to human, but aren't, occupying what in another context would be called the uncanny valley. The ultrasound heartbeat continues as the creatures gasp and groan and writhe and grow rapidly sprouting hair, Sutherland's afro, Elizabeth's long dark locks. Bennell's hand rests on the floor as wisps of white hair reach up at it. His skin begins to flake. Only at the last moment does Nancy wake him up. Again, she has a brilliant scream. Veronica Cartwright, the actress, does terror better than almost any actor in recent times, combining as she does fear with a potent powerlessness. She is not going to leap into action and save the day. She is an ordinary woman witnessing true horror, and doesn't require any trickery on the part of the director, as in the case of Ridley Scott in Alien, to elicit a totally believable response. Bennell tries to call the police. "Wait right there, Mr. Bennell," says the woman on the other end. But he didn't tell them his name. So we know now that all those he called for help earlier, all those comfortably reassuring officials, all those institutions we trust, have fallen to the conspiracy. Outside, people, the police, yes, but ordinary people too, are barricading the street. They go to flee, but before they leave, Bennell makes to destroy the almost fully formed bodies in his garden. He and Elizabeth are almost indistinguishable already from the real he and Elizabeth. As he smashes his own head in, people in the street outside and on balconies overlooking them give that inhuman scream. It follows them as they flee down the stairs out into the night, tailed by neighbours who aren't their neighbours anymore. We have a pretty good idea now how far the thing is spread locally, and the signs that should reassure us become signs designed to scare us. The police outrider pulling up on the motorbike is after the innocent, not the guilty. There's no one they can trust save themselves. They're cornered until Belichick, in a kind of redemptive moment, remember he's the stereotypical useless, disgruntled poet at the beginning, creates a distraction, running off and leading the pursuers away, and Nancy, who clearly adores him, goes too, leaving Elizabeth and Bennell alone. An almost comical scene follows as they try to make it through the city streets unnoticed. The camera seldom moves above ground level. The action is in the form of moving legs. Elizabeth and Bennell pass a crowd of feet going in the other direction. After a pause, the crowd turns to follow them. We hear the screech again, and now they're being chased down a busy main street in full view of what should have been ordinary people. The extraordinary becoming the ordinary is a sign of the success of the conspiracy. It's been a silent coup. The subsequent scene both works and doesn't, and probably belongs at an earlier point in the film. The chase just stops. There's no sign of the pursuers. Bennell and Elizabeth are walking again, this time down a seedier road flanked by adult cinemas, with the quarters trying to entice them inside, promising them all kinds of illicit delights that will make you feel like a new man. Again, earlier in the film this would work, A, because you don't know whether these peddlers of sin are the ordinary type, B, because if they aren't, it gives an insight into how the thing has spread as far as it has, how something so innocuous as pornographic films could have been used to ensnare people unwittingly. Unfortunately placed here, after an abortive chase scene that ends for no reason, it doesn't quite have the effect it might have had earlier in the film when it was slower, when the thing was being built, when we and our heroes were either unaware or at least less aware of what was going on. They get into a taxi, and by now you've got the point. Is he or isn't he? Genuine or fake? Escape or a trap? The driver asks where they're heading. They say they're going to the airport, not to leave, but to pick someone up, someone coming in from Boston. An obvious ruse, but they can't risk telling the truth. Up ahead there's a roadblock. People are being hauled out of their vehicles. As the taxi driver makes to give them away, they escape out of the back door and run, this time through a suspiciously empty garden, keeping to the shadows. The film excels at callbacks. I said earlier you should remember the ancillary characters. Here we see the homeless man and his dog again, both asleep beside a pod. Bennell kicks the pod, which leaks some kind of red fluid. Once again, remember this, it's not as innocuous as it first appears. Finally, hiding in the kitchen at Elizabeth's lab, they share a furtive kiss somewhat redolent of Winston Smith and Julia in the woods in 1984, and one suspects a deliberate homage, given what comes next. In another callback to the original, they look out of the window and see people being organised in the street below them, forming lines carrying seed pods to trucks destined for other towns, other cities. And then they're caught by the police. It's a little sudden, it's not quite believable, but it is, again, one of the few places where the film really does fall down. Kibner is there, and so is Jack Belichick, who has obviously been captured himself. Recall that Belichick loathed Kibner? Not anymore. He's changed. Minds and memories remain intact, but those inconvenient things, emotions, are gone. There's no need for hate now, or love, Kibner says. Kibner injects them with something to make them sleep, a mild sedative. Not especially fast-acting, it must be said, because Kibner still has time to do a bit of exposition, explaining that the aliens came from a dying planet, serving the solar winds, adapting and surviving. It's a little boilerplate by modern standards, but at the time would have been closer to innovation. And then they still have the time and energy to fight back, to kill Jack, to trap Kibner in the fridge. Once again, The Shining comes to mind. And they're off again, running, looking for some way out of the city. They run into Nancy again. The first in-the-moment is she or isn't she event featuring one of our main cast. She's not, it turns out, one of them. She's mastered the art of moving among them, the trick being to show no emotion, to hide your feelings. Sound advice walking through any city, it must be said, and a pretty good way of avoiding charity campaigners and beggars alike. The penultimate big callback to the seemingly innocuous, you will, I'm sure, have recalled the beggar and his dog from the beginning, last seen asleep by the pod. You might not recall that Bennell kicked the pod, causing it to leak, because at the time it seems almost accidental and certainly not important. Yet it is, because it's this that gives them away. Walking as they are without emotion, damaging the pod made something go wrong, and they come upon the dog with the head of the beggar. It requires a bit of imagination to make this as horrifyingly surreal as it was doubtless intended to be, as the effects aren't quite there, the technology not quite able to pull it off. It looks comical, not especially helped by the inexplicable strumming of a banjo from somewhere. It's one area where the later remake of The Thing is unquestionably superior, because the practical effects used there don't actually look fake. They are, if anything, overly visceral, but undeniably horrifying. The dog with the face of the beggar in Body Snatchers could have benefited from a few years' development in the field of practical effects, but we must make do with it as it is, and forgive it its failings. The horror of it causes Elizabeth to lose her composure, and so they are discovered and chased off by what now amounts to an entire population's worth of pod people. The only one to keep her cool here is Nancy, and for the final time, keep that in mind. The film does suspense much better than it does action, and if there's one segment of the film that can be called unconvincing, it's this penultimate scene, though the ending does, I think, make up for it. They escape to the edge of town, toward the sea, where they find warehouses where the seed pods are grown, loaded onto trucks. Through a field of high grasses they find a ship, but Elizabeth, who has somehow got through this entire film wearing high heels, slips and twists her ankle. She could have taken lessons from what's-her-name in Jurassic World, who navigates much more difficult terrain in considerably higher heels. She can't go on, which is a shame, because on the other side of the field is a ship blaring Amazing Grace on bagpipes, which is quite affecting. That tune on the bagpipes can't be anything but effective, but also a little silly. Bennell says they can get away, but why, if the whole city has been overtaken and the seed pod factory is literally 5 minutes down the road, would the ship have been left alone? And sure enough, Bennell sees hundreds of pods being loaded onto it. So much for that plan. He returns to Elizabeth to find she's fallen asleep. He tries to wake her up, but no, she's gone. Which is quite sad until she crumples like a paper bag, and Donald Sutherland has something that can best be described as an aneurysm, aborted by the sudden emergence of Elizabeth's naked double, who does a little bit of exposition and tries unconvincingly to sway him to her side. He runs off, as is probably sensible when meeting naked alien women in fields of long grass. There follows a bit of a silly sequence in which he goes running about in the rafters of the seed pod factory, grabbing a fire axe and cutting down the lighting rigs, which explode, as light bulbs famously do, and set fire to the warehouse. For some reason, the Elizabeth duplicate doesn't do the screech and alert people to his presence until after he set the place on fire, but eventually she does, and he runs off again. The ending is probably the most iconic part of the film. We never see Bennell get captured, and the film picks up again at some unspecified point in the future, following him as he walks around his old haunts, his office, Elizabeth's office, down the street, doing exactly as Nancy told him to do earlier, act as one of them, showing no emotion, no feeling. For the first time since the second third of the film began, the audience is put back in a position of ignorance, of unknowing. We see school buses being brought in from various counties around San Francisco. "Why do we have to take our nap now?" one of the children asks. "I'm not tired." It's a relatively subtle thing that's easy to miss on first viewing, but shows again another of the banal ways in which this conspiracy has flourished. Guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. By normalcy, not the extraordinary. A silent coup that, in a call forward, arguably, to our own day, at the same time as being a call backward to theirs, proceeds by the turning of what's normal, our institutions, our associations, by stealth, not by force. It ends before the Capitol building of San Francisco, one of those miniature White Houses that pepper the states. And here again is Nancy, ostensibly the most helpless of the group, but the only one who has the wit and ingenuity to survive, at least until this moment. It is explicable. You could argue that she has been alone for so long that she cannot help herself. You can say it's a product of her naivety, which would at least be based on an established character trait. Neither of these are quite believable, however, because she gives herself away by calling out to Bennell, and if she was always liable to do something like that, how did she ever survive? But whatever its faults, it does at least set up the memorable final scene. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is, I think, undeniably a gripping film, though the first two-thirds rather carry the final act. But as a genre piece, it's unsurpassed except arguably by The Thing. It does paranoia and suspense better than most spy flicks and straightforward suspense films do. It's also undeniably an exceptional remake. As I intimated at the outset, it's a fascinating social study, reaching the logical, emotional, and cultural apogee of the suspicion of communist infiltration that is only really setting in the 1956 original. To use a banal formulation, it captures perfectly the mood of its day, and then carries it further in the way only fiction, and science fiction in particular, can do. In one sense, it is extreme, and it was born in an age of extremes. Strong ideologies produce art that mirrors their own psychology. In the late 1970s and the 1980s in particular saw America at an ideological high point, hence the proliferation of fantastical heroic types in Rocky, in Rambo, and action flicks generally. It was not coincidental that the ideological high point came about at precisely the same time as the perceived ideological high point of the Soviet Union, which is what gives rise to films that, read now as parables against communism, often appear extreme. One can read both Body Snatchers and The Thing through this lens, though they are in fact subtler than many other attempts at overtly anti-communist filmmaking. For one of the most hilariously unsubtle equivalents, take a look at The 27th Day, made as far back as 1957, in which alien devices are given to people of different nations that have the power to kill all human life. The mathematical code behind them is broken, and the American representative uses them to destroy all enemies of human freedom, and then they all live happily ever after, the implication being that those nasty Soviets and Maoists have all been wiped out. It is, though, unfashionable to be ideological these days, at least in the West. We're now a bit embarrassed by the gung-ho machismo of our recent past. The descendants of that intellectual tradition didn't see a great deal wrong with socialism or Soviet communism at the time, which is to say much of the media and the academic elite, look back at history and are, lo and behold, disdainful of those who did see a great deal wrong with socialism and Soviet communism at the time. That's an argument that shouldn't need relitigating. It does, and we'll do so in other videos on this channel. But whatever the rights and manifest wrongs of Cold War positions, it is, I would argue, our lack of belief now in anything even remotely resembling an ideology that makes us incapable of producing anything like The Thing or Invasion of the Body Snatchers today. That is partly attributable to a lack of a codified opposing ideology that forces the audience to choose and assert their fundamental values. We don't yet see China in this light, though arguably we should. And if one looks at the output of Chinese cinema with films like The Wandering Earth, it's clear the Chinese themselves suffer no equivalent lack of vision. Hard times create strong men, the maxim goes. Strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Somewhere between the weak men and the hard times are found bad writers and bad directors. If modern Hollywood seems to us valueless, it is in large part because we ourselves are valueless. Our lack of values manifests in a profound lack of imagination, which feeds then into our films, which are in large part devoid of anything approaching a moral message or an underpinning belief. I don't particularly wish to end by offering black pills, but it's that makes Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Thing remarkable not only as remakes, but as cultural signifiers, and it's why we don't produce their like today.